The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Krishna Vadula from UMass Lowell. We are just delighted to have, wow, this is the 11th webinar. Wow, good going, guys, from Business School to Center for Entrepreneurship here at UMass Lowell. So today we have with us, the topic today is social media, creating new possibilities for entrepreneurs. And we have with us uh, Dr. Spencer Ross. To do the introductions, I'm going to give the screen back to Michael Kuyuta. Okay, so Michael, click show my screen, and you should be ready to go. Yep.
Okay, great. Let me get this into
Slideshow mode. Yeah.
slideshow mode. Okay, well, welcome again. Thank you all for attending. If this is your first time, welcome to the webinar series. If you've been with us before, thank you for returning. So I'm Professor Michael Kuyuta here at the Manning School of Business at UMass Lowell, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Spencer Ross. We're both in the Department of Marketing, Entrepreneurship, and Innovation. I focus on entrepreneurship and innovation. Dr. Ross focuses on marketing, and specifically today, he's going to be talking to you about social media, creating new possibilities for entrepreneurs. So with that, I'll turn it over, and if you can start sharing Spencer's screen, that would be great.
Okay, great. Getting over to Spencer. Click show my screen.
All right, thank you, Mike.
There you go.
All right, let me just minimize. There we go. All right, good morning, everyone. As Dr. Steers just said, my name is Spencer Ross, and I'm an assistant professor of marketing at the Manning School of Business at UMass Lowell. My focus is on kind of two things. One is sustainable consumption, but also I'm interested in how consumers use digital technologies, new technologies, and so forth. And I've been working on some social media projects as well. One of which has to do with how brands interact with other brands on Twitter and other types of platforms, and how that potentially leads to increases in consumer perceptions of brands on social media. So kind of an agenda for the morning. The first thing I'm going to kind of talk about is a little bit of social network theory. I'm not sure how many people out there are knowledgeable about social networks and social networking. We'll get into some of the basics about social network theory and how that works with interaction on social media in particular. We'll talk a little bit about some of the business strategies in terms of how different platforms are giving opportunities for businesses to use social media. So we'll go through one type of model that describes the way generally social media is used. And then we'll talk a little bit about platforms and in specific how we align content with the different networks, and kind of getting back to some of the basics with, you know, finding a target market, segmenting a market, and figuring out how to strategize which content goes on which platforms for which markets. So with that, we'll start with discussing a little bit about social interaction here. If we look at a social network, there's some basic properties. If we look at various things like nodes, nodes are individuals or people in a social network. We have links between those nodes, links between people, which we call ties. And just as you might be familiar with, there are different types of intensities of ties, of links between nodes. So I know some people much more strongly, my family, my friends. I have acquaintances that are a little bit looser. So there are a little bit more differences in the type of intensities that people have with other individuals in their networks. And so we also see that in the form of what we call multiplicity, which is these different types of ties between the pairs of nodes. So that's kind of the basic structure of the social network that you can see here. We'll talk a little bit about some of the theories behind this. Social network grounds itself in sociology, and it uses sociometry to measure both how many nodes there are and what type of strength of links or ties between the nodes there are. One of the early theories in social network theory talks about something called strong versus weak ties. And I had just mentioned that there's some information or some tie strengths that are stronger than others. For instance, your friends or your very close friends in your family you might have a stronger tie with. Whereas your acquaintances, you would have that weak, what we call weaker tie. The theory behind the strength of weak ties is that the stronger the connections there are, the more information shared has in common. So for instance, the information that you receive from very close friends and very close family, because of your intimacy, your closeness, the strength of that tie, there's going to be a lot of information in common, and therefore because a lot of that information is common, a lot of it is going to be redundant. So where this theory of the strength of weak ties comes in is that nodes in a network that are outside or are slightly weaker, for instance, is your acquaintances or people you might meet at a networking event, that actually is going to bring new information into your social network. And as a result, if you're an entrepreneur, for instance, you're going to be actively seeking out more information from other networks to be able to help pull into your own network that new information. So the idea, again, behind the strength of weak ties is that we get a lot of new non-redundant information from sources that we are not necessarily strong with, but maybe are loosely connected with in some sort of way. In another theory created by Burt in 1978 and in 1992, we look at social capital as both the direct and indirect influence that an individual has within a network. So how do I directly influence individuals within my network, and how do I in a network indirectly influence those individuals? So for instance, if you know multiple people or you're working with multiple people, you may give information or pass information to one person who's going to pass that information to another person, and therefore that type of influence is going to be indirect but still have some sort of value and still wield social capital. The other theory that Burt proposed was something called the theory of structural holes, which is to say that two networks are not always directly linked. So if you see here in the picture, there is a bridge or a broker as somebody who is what we call occupying the structural hole between two networks. So for instance, if you're an individual who is both kind of in one group of entrepreneurs and another group of entrepreneurs, or a group of entrepreneurs and a group that has capital, you may be the structural hole or occupying the structural hole. You may be the actor who is the tie between two networks. And as a result, there is some power in occupying the structural hole. There is a power in connecting those two networks that are not directly linked. You become the indirect link between those networks. So those kind of theories are helpful for us to understand how innovation spreads throughout social networks, and they've been kind of the fundamentals of how social networking and social media platforms have spread information throughout. If we look, for instance, at how networking is beneficial to getting information out there, there is a law proposed in 1993, not a legislative law, but a law for telecommunications, where the power of a network increases relative to each new connection. So you can see, for instance, with the telephone, having a single telephone is not beneficial unless you have a partner on the recipient end. And in that case, you have one connection with two devices. As you add multiple devices, the layer of connections increases exponentially. So the economic value of a network of communicating individuals is actually, like I said, proportional to the square of the number of users on the system. The Metcalfe's law has been expanded to show that subgroups actually form on a network, and that kind of works relative to entrepreneurial communities, that works relative to brand communities, that works in a variety of different ways where we see kind of these subgroups or communities forming on these networks. And in fact, the value of the network actually goes even beyond what Metcalfe's law proposed, because there is actually group effects taking place on these platforms. So as a result, social activity on social networks depends and relies on the transmission of data. And if you've likely heard the term viral marketing, viral information, a lot of that has to do with the ability to retransmit, just like a virus, which is where the analogy comes from, to retransmit that data onto other users or other people who might be seeking that information. So there are two forms that people are interested in terms of that retransmission. The first is how active a transmitter actually is. So how often, for instance, does a person on social media post? How frequently do they post? Or how frequently does a brand or an organization post? And that is important in one element. And the other element is how much reach does that transmitter have? How much reach does that person have? So when you think about things like Facebook influencers, or you think about things like Twitter influencers or Instagram influencers, a lot of that has to do with how many followers they have, what their reach is. However, there is a trade-off, or there can be a trade-off between the reach that a person has, the reach that an influencer has, and how often that they're posting. And that's kind of been one of the things that has been studied recently in the research on social networking, in particular with marketing, is whether it is one is better than the other. And in fact, the jury is still out on this. There is value to having somebody who has a lot of followers, but if that person does not frequently post, then their information ends up being kind of lost in what other followers or consumers are actually seeing. So the ideal is to otherwise balance that frequency with the reach. Social interaction matters because information essentially functions as currency. And in fact, some have called data the new oil in terms of its value as a marketplace. One of the things that social media does in particular for marketers is it helps on two elements of the traditional marketing funnel. The first is it helps create awareness with other potential consumers. So it helps draw people in, particularly in brand building exercises. And the other is through word of mouth, otherwise known as advocacy in the marketing funnel, where other people who have bought or purchased a product or purchased a service are otherwise explaining or retransmitting their desire or their positive attitudes towards other consumers in their social networks. Okay, so when we're talking about that, the goal is to have positive advocacy rather than negative advocacy or negative word of mouth. So this is beneficial because when we look at things like building products or building services, the goal is to have people potentially be actually talking about these products or services, to be able to have advocates for these products or services in a way where if you're going camping, for instance, it is a social experience that you otherwise are talking to other people about. If you're going grocery shopping, that is not always an experience that you're otherwise telling people about, that you're not always telling people what positive or negative experience you have. So even things like experiences are shareable because of that social connection. So the idea is to create things that are that people find interesting and engaging, to create a deep volume of connections and of use and of content, as well as creating interactions with multiple users, so multiple retransmissions where the story, where the interaction actually is expanded as it passes through the social network. If we're looking at some of the strategies that businesses are using, one model that I like to discuss is the model called the peso model. And what the peso model is it looks like this, okay? If we look at people using digital, we see that every year over year, the amount of people on the internet, the amount of people on social media, the amount of people using mobile, and in particular, the amount of people using mobile social is increasing. So in 2017, 34% of the planet was on mobile social. 2018, 39%. 2019, 42%. So we're seeing these increases in the number of people who are online, the number of people who are actively using social media, and even more tellingly, the number of people who are actively using social media on mobile devices. That has been, as you see here, a trend, an upward trend every year. When we look at how social platforms are used by businesses, I like this model because it kind of shows two things. One is how social media can be used to push information out to consumers to make them more aware of brands, of products, and of areas for potential access to those products, to solutions that marketers or innovators are otherwise offering, but also to pull people in by creating more active engagement. So we see here on the left both the paid media and owned properties models of social media. And I'll show you a couple examples of each. With paid, that's kind of the traditional advertising approach. That's kind of the traditional coming up with some sort of sponsored content or paid post, or similar to Google AdWords model, where you're paying for people to actually see your efforts. Okay. The second approach in the push model is the owned content. And that's where you're owning your own platforms, owning your own content, and you're responsible for creating and distributing them on your own channels. And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. The pull types of social media are twofold. First of all is the earned model, and that is typical of what we see in traditional public relations, where content is created about a product or service by other outside sources at no cost to the company. This is areas where other media, such as newspapers or magazines, may be testing out your product or testing out your service and are otherwise writing about it and then putting it on their platforms. And then that gives you actually an opportunity now to be able to share that on your own platforms, on your own social media channels. And the last one is the social or shared platforms, which are ones we're commonly familiar with, like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, where you're actually creating the content for your brand or product or service, and you are sharing them on these channels, but you are not actually owning these channels. So obviously we may have a page on Facebook, or we may have a page on Twitter, but we don't actually own Twitter and we don't actually own Facebook. So we are actually at the behest of these social platforms. But they're obviously, as we discussed, they're beneficial to getting word of mouth out to other people in these social networks. So examples of paid media, for instance, you could see here as an example of sponsored posts that I've kind of got in the dotted lines, where these companies are paying to have these posts promoted in a particular feed. So presumably what they are doing is looking at various types of demographics that Twitter is offering, to be able to pay to reach a particular demographic or a particular series of demographics, and they're paying to promote a particular ad or a particular post within the feed of the targeted demographic. And obviously this kind of has a little bit of a hybrid connection, because as you can see on the right, there is actually the ability to engage with some of these posts. So we can actually see from sponsored posts whether they have been retransmitted in the form of retweets, whether they have been acknowledged or favorited in the form of likes, and so forth. So that actually gives us a little bit of metrics to our advertisements in terms of engagement that we did not necessarily have in traditional forms of advertising, even in forms of other banner ads or other paid keyword ads elsewhere in digital advertising. In terms of owned media, I mentioned that this is more of a public relations type of media approach on social media. You can see here, for instance, that Audi had some form of public relations stunt where they sent an electric SUV up a mountain. And you can see here that Wired, which is a magazine that deals with various types of technology, consumer technology, Wired had actually written about what Audi had done, and Audi then had retweeted it, as you can see at the top of this post. So this gives credibility to the posts by outside sources. So Wired is seen as a credible source. They're giving a press release and a video of this particular public relations stunt, and Audi is therefore able to retransmit this credible source to its followers, to the followers of the brand. On shared media, we are able to create content, share it on channels, and we've seen some of this as shared media. One of the things, as I mentioned before, is that we are able to track on shared media things such as engagement. So we can figure out how many impressions of a particular post that people had seen, which means how many eyeballs were on that particular post. We can find out how a post was engaged with, so how many people retransmitted that post or clicked on the video and watched the video within a post. We can look at whether the post was favorited or liked or given some form of reaction. So those are various ways that content is otherwise measured in terms, and we can analyze how content was actually engaged with and interacted with at the same time, as well as retransmitted. And so examples of this may be, for instance, on a shared platform. Here's a brand of travel pillow in the United Kingdom, and you can see on the left there is a post of theirs on Instagram that has 20 likes. This is content that they've created and shared on a channel they do not own. And then on the right, what they've actually done is they've created a community or a brand community to be able to have people who are traveling share travel tips with each other. They, for instance, moderate this community and they step in and they step out of it. However, they actually do not give a lot of push into what their product is. What they're looking to do is actually promote travel and have the community kind of self-promote the product itself. And so they're able to do that on the Facebook platform in this type of group. In terms of own media, what we see is original content that's created and distributed on our own channels. So for instance, you can see here on the left, the Home Depot, the hardware store, the home renovation store. They've created a community of their own on their own website that they control, that they manage, that they moderate, and that they distribute. And they are able, therefore, to have total ownership of this media, but also allow for the community element of this media. Okay, and allow for the sharing and the social interaction within this. Here in the middle, we have Target, the retailer, who has a blog, and it's not a blog on a separate platform, but a blog on their own owned server, their own owned website. And what they do, you can see here, is they're sharing style tips, they're sharing information about what's going on in the company, and in both cases, they actually have the ability to both share on Facebook and to tweet this out. So again, there's another layer of the social component to this. And on the right, we see the microchip manufacturer, the video graphics chip manufacturer, NVIDIA, who is actually, just as we are, having a webinar, or had a webinar, on deploying artificial intelligence with Amazon Web Services and machine learning and IoT, Internet of Things services, on one of their new chips. So by doing this, again, you're bringing people in, allowing them that interaction, and providing a way on your own platforms to be able to create content and have that being socially engaged with. So those are the different types of ways that social media allows companies to otherwise have various options, some of which actually overlap with each other. Again, the idea of having paid media that can also be shared is something that you don't necessarily get on other types of traditional digital advertising. When we look at these in terms of the platforms that are out there, there are definitely a myriad of them. And so what we see is that even when we compare, this is a company called Domo who came out with this infographic in 2013, and we see here that on the left, we're talking about how many websites are on WordPress, new blog posts are on the blog publishing platform WordPress. We see how many search queries Google has. And it's kind of interesting when we look at this from 2013 to 2018 that in 2013, 3,600 new photos were shared every minute, every day. In 2018, 49,000 pictures were shown every day or uploaded on Instagram every day. Twitter, 100,000 tweets a minute in 2013. By 2018, 473,400 tweets a minute. YouTube, 4.3 million videos. Okay, LinkedIn, 120 new professionals a minute. Jiffy, serving up GIFs online, 1.4 million GIFs a minute in 2018. 79,000, almost 80,000 posts a minute on Tumblr. And we see these are rapidly changing. You know, you see Tumblr, Reddit, Venmo. We don't think as much about Venmo as a form of social media, but the interactive elements of peer-to-peer payment system is also considered social media. Spotify is as well. We don't think about these things back in 2013, and yet now we've shown rapid growth. And even in 2019, those numbers have all increased again year over year between 2018 and 2019. So there's a lot of information that's being generated on a minute-by-minute basis. And yet, if anybody remembers MySpace, what's here today in a platform and what's shown incredible growth in a platform does not necessarily mean that tomorrow it's going to be around. So today's MySpace may be tomorrow's TikTok. And I think a lot of us familiar with TikTok, the short videos where people are doing various viral things in short video form and sharing them with their friends. And again, this is kind of the new phenomenon of today, but we don't know what will happen tomorrow, okay? There are a myriad of social media platforms out there, but is it necessary for us to look at the entire media landscape, the entire social media landscape? I would argue that it's actually more beneficial to focus on the consumer, to focus on target markets, to focus on leveraging what we know about how our users or how our consumers interact to be able to look at whether we should be on a particular platform or not. The landscape is growing so exponentially in terms of new platform development as well. You can see here, for instance, in January of 2019 that yes, Facebook has 2.2 billion users on a unique monthly active users. YouTube has 1.9 billion monthly active users. So these are definitely platforms that have been fairly stable. I think it's fairly safe to say that they're not necessarily going away anytime soon, and yet these are not platforms that every consumer is going to be on. You can see down towards the bottom, for instance, that Twitter is actually 300 in kind of in the middle of the pack with 326 million users on a monthly basis. So despite being a network that has a prominent amount of influence, it is not a network that, in comparison to Facebook, has a large user base, particularly on an active user base. But actually, Twitter has a user base that is fairly active on a daily basis, whereas Facebook has a lot of users who may not necessarily be as active on a daily basis. So understanding and doing some research on some of the characteristics of these platforms is important because it helps gain an understanding of which platforms you should be on relative to the types of consumers that you actually have and what their usage characteristics are. Here's an example. If we look at social media use in 2018, on the left we see that 51% of people are using Facebook several times a day, but we actually see 26% of people using Facebook less often than once a day. YouTube, same thing. 55% are not using it once a day, less often than once a day, despite the fact that we had said on the previous slide that almost 2 billion people are actively using YouTube on a monthly basis. So looking even at the daily characteristics of usage becomes important in aligning that with target markets. On the right, we see a Pew Research survey conducted in the US where social media platforms by age group varied and the usage characteristics varied by age group. So 94% of 18 to 24-year-olds in the US are using YouTube, but only 56% are using of the 50 plus year old age group are actually using YouTube. So obviously we see some generational or age disparities in the way that certain users are using certain platforms. 7% of 50 or older are using Snapchat, whereas 78% of 18 to 24-year-olds are using Snapchat. So again, a lot of this depends on usage characteristics in terms of reaching target audiences. So when considering looking at launching a particular campaign on social media, I think a lot of people who especially do not have the capital to do so look at it and say, well, we should take a kitchen sink approach and put our content everywhere. And the reality is, if you're looking for an effective and efficient return on investment, then it helps to go back and look at some of the traditional marketing research principles and kind of align those with social media platforms. So if we go back and we look at things like market segmentation and target marketing, the goal is to understand how different users use different platforms. So yes, we can segment in terms of geography and which platforms are used in which countries. We can look at demographics as shown on the previous slide, where certain users of certain ages are more inclined to use Facebook, whereas others are more inclined to use Twitter, and others are more inclined to use Instagram. And certainly a very younger demographic is looking at using TikTok. In the US, there's been kind of an interesting sub-demographic of users on a photo sharing platform called Visco. This is not one, it's kind of a very similar to Instagram, but the much smaller, and the user characteristics actually tend to trend a little bit younger than the the age of the average Instagram user. And so looking at those characteristics and of your target audience, of your target market, is helpful to understand which platforms otherwise you're looking to be on. So taking a target market approach to platform and content management becomes important. I labeled a number of these types of buckets that there are different types of platforms for different types of markets. Okay, we see here what we traditionally know as video sharing platforms. We have payment platforms such as Venmo or PayPal. We have music platforms that we don't necessarily think about social sharing. And I'll actually show you a brand that has used Spotify to engage on social music. We have photo sharing, we have location sharing, we have we've recently found other uses for platforms like Tinder, which is now kind of traditionally been known as a dating app or a way of seeking out other people, where we're now seeing brands who are actually trying to get into that and leverage some of the advertising elements and the paid media on these dating apps. Here's an example of a mattress company that's based in the US. They are one of these newer types of bed-in-a-box mattress companies called Casper. And what they actually do is, you can see here on a variety of different platforms, they're pushing out different types of content. So on the upper left, you see their website. Tomorrow, or the end of this week, is Black Friday, so they're starting to do their sales. But to the left of that, in kind of the black framing, is an Instagram story of theirs, which is very similar to Snapchat content. So you have media that shifts every day, requiring them to create different types of content on a daily basis. On the bottom left, you see their Instagram profile where they are showing various types of ways and kind of building a brand around sleep. Around the middle, you see their Facebook page. They are showing, again, an example of earned media, where Time Magazine has listed them as one of the best, their night light has listed them as one of the best inventions of 2019, and they're able to share, again, that credible outside source on their social media platform. In the bottom middle, you see their LinkedIn. One way of using LinkedIn is potentially to draw people into, obviously, to provide content about their product, but also to potentially get people who are interested in careers at Casper. And so in this instance, one of their co-founders was talking to Fast Company. So again, another instance where earned media becomes shared media. In the upper right, you see their Twitter feed. They show pictures of dogs. Interestingly, their product mix has some dog beds in it. So not just for human beds, but dogs as well. So they often share content with dogs on their Twitter feed. And on the bottom right, you can actually see two instances where they have both a podcast and a mix of music on Spotify. So they've leveraged the sharing elements of Spotify and created some content on Spotify and curated some content on Spotify that you can actually listen to music that would otherwise help you fall asleep, or you can listen to a podcast that maybe contains some ASMR and again, be able to help you fall asleep. So again, this is kind of different non-traditional type of content that they are putting out on social networks that we may not necessarily think of as traditional. But again, the goal is to get both engagement and interaction from users on these platforms. They also created a bot. So this is an example of owned media. This particular bot, if you can't fall asleep between 11 o'clock at night and 5 o'clock in the morning, you can go on insomnabot3000.com and be able to talk to this bot, which is AI. And for whomever likes to be able to talk to a robot all night, or even on the phone, you can do this as well. You have the option to do that. And again, that is a form of owned media. And it kind of gives on the back end some data and insight to the company about the Casper user who's otherwise looking to talk to somebody at night. And you can see in all, you can actually like, share, and tweet this link out to your social networks. So again, it allows for the social interaction and the sharing of this to get some word of mouth out as well. And I'm gonna like to finish on this with kind of a cute infographic that I've seen updated periodically. I tried finding a little bit more recent one of this because there has not, a couple of these actually are no longer in existence. Obviously, Google Plus is no longer in existence. Vine is no longer in existence. But I think it kind of highlights the way that we approach social media by looking at cats. And saying that if you were to look at Facebook, I like my cat, or Twitter, my cat's shredding on her guitar, or YouTube, watching a video of my cat, we kind of see how these different platforms have different content that appeals to different types of users. So again, if we were to look at this from both a behavioral and a psychographic and a demographic perspective of a particular target market, we may want to look at how specifically users on these platforms and what types of specific features of these platforms, how they differentiate themselves, and how users on these platforms differentiate themselves as well. So the goal, again, in this instance, is to otherwise get interaction and engagement in content and be able to leverage these networks to pass information through. Again, as we mentioned in the beginning, part of it is looking at how new information disseminates into different types of networks, across networks, bridges those networks using influencers who are occupying structural holes, and be able to pass content along to weaker ties who might then share that information within their own social networks. And with that, I will otherwise ask if anybody has any questions.
Wow, that's really great, Spencer. Fantastic presentation. I myself have a lot of questions, but let me give this back to Mike. Do you want to, you want to take the screen, or what do you want to do, Mike?
No, let's, I guess, do the questions now, and then I'll come back and just
Great.
to wrap it up at the very end.
Okay, yeah. So we open to questions. I'm looking for participants, about 35 participants with us today. And hopefully there'll be some questions. Many of them have been saying, send me the video, send me the recording, send me the PowerPoint slides. So we'll do that. But let's have some questions. And I'm particularly, from my own selfish point of view, I have a couple of few questions. Maybe that'll get started. And Spencer, this is what we're doing is it's a webinar series, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is outstanding information. Hundreds of thousands of people should have been listening to this webinar and learning about it, right? So that's a social networking thing, right? And I have, and just to give you a little background and what we do with the IUCE, which is the which are hosting this webinar series for Ashwin Mehta. We work with more than 100, 200 colleges all over India, engineering colleges and business colleges. The idea being to improve the quality of the education they provide. And so, webinars like this are an important part of how that they learn us what's happening around the world. Absolutely. And build it into their programs. Okay, so but I'm not tech savvy with all this social networking. I'm 74 years old, and I really haven't been brought up with the generation. So I'm looking at this and saying, wow, the way I publicize these webinars, which are having, some of them from UMass Lowell, I have others that come from other sources. Right. So we typically have 2 or 3 webinars every week of interest to the broader community that we are trying to engage. Sometimes I'm thinking, how do I maximize this what we're doing through this social networking? The process that I use right now is very straightforward. I have a list of email IDs, and I use Constant Contact as a way to connect with 20,000 or so email IDs there. And then I take this announcement that you have seen that I sent to Ashwin and other people. I send this through Constant Contact with a link to the webinars. Okay, now that's a very straightforward, simplistic approach of doing it. How do I build on that? How do I make sure many more people who should be out there should be listening to it and learning about it and joining? Would Facebook be the way to go? I mean, how would I maximize the use of Facebook to build on getting more audience participation? Because once I get the audience participation, then the next step, of course, is how to build communities out of the people who participate. And then again, that's another space where maybe Facebook. I saw one of your slides showing how communities are formed and talk to each other. Because people who are joining, you let them talk to each other on their own. We don't have to really. Right. There all the time. So we have communities that are talking about improving teaching and learning. We have communities that are talking about doing projects for the community, and so on. So, what do you think? And what's your general advice? Maybe I should make an appointment and come and chat with you one day here on campus. What do you think?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think if we're looking particularly at the state of social networks right now, and we're looking at this program as a whole, as a global program. I think right now Facebook is probably the most stable, globally ubiquitous of the social networks. I mean, it kind of depends. I think there may be platforms that may be specific in terms of higher user rates in certain countries. In the US, for instance, it's interesting because when I talk to undergraduates, a lot of them do not spend much time on Facebook. A lot of my undergraduates, when I kind of informally poll them, they're basically saying that they're going to other social media sites, or the majority of their time, and it kind of reflects what we saw in that Pew Research poll. A lot of them are otherwise saying, I am on there, as a 20-year-old, and I am discussing things, maybe so my mom, who's also on there, or my grandmother, some of them who are also on there, can see, periodic updates. But by and large, I'm using WhatsApp with my friends, or I'm using Instagram with my friends. I keep my my profile much more private there, and therefore I'm just kind of following some brands and following my friends, and I don't want other users to otherwise see me. And then you've got the flip side where you've got, people who are in their 20s who are also using Instagram, and students of mine who are saying, I'm going to try and be an influencer in a particular area. So Facebook is interesting because it happens, like I said, I think it's one of the largest of the communities, or the largest of the platforms out there to be able to create communities on. And then I think, again, when we look at like LinkedIn, which is another one which would be, kind of a perfect community orientation, particular to business people. That's one where, Microsoft owns it. It's got worldwide ubiquity, and I think a lot of people are on that globally. And so there's opportunities to create communities there. And then, like you had said, there's kind of these other, where are business students currently, on in terms of other social media platforms, and especially when you're a global endeavor like the GE2 programs, you're looking at this and saying, okay, well, we want to be on a platform where we can get the most amount of people globally. And so perhaps LinkedIn is the place to go, particularly in a business context. But so I think a lot of it has to do with, I think you're right. I think starting communities around this and kind of creating those types of groups where you've got the value of subgroups within a broader network, but also are able to take webinar links and share them and pass them along within those communities becomes very important. So I think it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid approach, both in terms of getting the content out there in posts, but also, like you said, creating communities where those posts can be shared.
So you're saying Facebook and LinkedIn may be something that I should try to use. I think because the people in India are also catching up. The faculty are still a little bit behind like I am. And so right now our target audience is mostly faculty, but a bunch of students also. I think students are a little bit ahead in some of the newer technologies. So I'm thinking, okay, so if I were to focus on Facebook and LinkedIn, and I've dabbled in those two a little bit, but I've always been confused as to how to best build communities on those. Is there some guidebook somewhere or some website that can help me learn how to build communities on Facebook or LinkedIn?
I know there's a number of there's kind of at the risk of there's kind of a whole industry of people who are looking kind of at specifically how to build community on these types of things. So, if you were to Google, building, brand communities on LinkedIn, for instance, you'd probably find a number of different results in that context. There's people like Gary Vaynerchuk who've talked about, how social media and creating content for that. There's been people like Seth Godin, who's kind of an infamous person who's talked about how to build these types of communities. Vala Afshar, who works at Salesforce and deals more with inbound marketing, but he's been kind of a person. So there are a lot of people who have been discussing kind of different sorts of long range, short range type of tactics on how to do this. And like I said, and a lot of them have books that talk about this.
I see books like Facebook for Dummies. Maybe I should get one of those.
Well, there's that too. There's certainly that too. And and the thing is, I mean, it seems kind of, it always seems kind of silly to get like a Facebook for Dummies type of book, but sometimes those types of books I think are beneficial to people who are not necessarily familiar, or kind of using it as a consumer, but not really approaching it from the exactly. And that's the thing. And even when I teach social media in my classes, and I've got students, and I tell them, I'm on all these platforms that you're on. I try and keep up to date with new and kind of platforms on the horizon, and will they actually be networks that have value? Going back to Metcalfe's law and Reed's law, will there actually be communities growing around these things, and is there actually a value of network based on connections? And I tell them, I say, the goal of my class, for instance, is to teach you how to think about these, because, these could be here today and gone tomorrow, but understanding the value of social interaction and the value of content alignment is probably the most important thing. If a network dies tomorrow and another one comes up, understanding how people interact with each other, I think, is most important. And sometimes it takes a dummies book a Facebook for Dummies book to say, oh yeah, I want to be quickly up to speed on some of the particular features of this platform, but the rest I can figure out because I understand how people work, and I understand how content works, and I understand how my desired market or my desired consumer or my target consumer may be using these markets. So it sounds silly. You kind of joke about using a Facebook for Dummies or Twitter for Dummies, but I don't see, if you're looking to get quickly up to speed, I don't necessarily think that there's a loss of value in getting something, a book like that.
Do you teach a course along these lines, like building social communities using social networks?
So we don't have a specific building social communities, but it definitely is one of the things that we discuss it in. I usually teach a section of social media marketing at UMass Lowell in the summer. And I know there's another section of it, I think both semesters during the year. And one of the things certainly that I focus in my section of the course is kind of looking at it from a community perspective. And I look at it at not just as terms of, okay, this has this content, feature that and today they've got stories and today they've got this, but more along the lines of how do you use this and what kind of content do you give to a brand community? And certainly there's been a lot of research in brand communities themselves and kind of in creating some of these online communities and fostering online communities using social media. A large portion of it is giving users content and allowing them, like you said, to kind of take it themselves, to accepting the fact that there is a level of control that you actually give up when you are using social media. Some of the most interesting brands that I see right now are brands that, and I've discussed this in class even this semester with some of my students, are brands that are really kind of pushing the envelope in the type of content they're creating. Some of it is content that is not something that an individual outside the target market would necessarily deem appropriate, for instance. But it aligns with the brand, it aligns with the goals of the brand, and it aligns with the community. And so it ends up being positive for the brand itself.
Okay, let me read off a couple of other questions. Other people I've hogged the questions myself. Akshay, I couldn't understand your question. It's something about what if impressions go on increasing but engagement doesn't increase. I'm not sure what you're trying to say there. What if impressions go on increasing but engagement doesn't increase? I don't know if you understand what you're saying.
So it sounds like the question is kind of looking at what if a lot of people are seeing your content but they're not actually engaging with it.
Okay.
And how I kind of see that is it's kind of a straightforward answer, I think, is to then reevaluate the type of content that you're putting out on a social network. If you're getting a lot of eyeballs, well, there's actually two things. Again, one is getting the eyeballs on it, so people actually seeing the content, which is obviously something that you want people to see. But then the goal is to look at what the purpose of the content is. In traditional advertising, for instance, getting eyeballs on, in a traditional newspaper, in a print newspaper, getting people to see the content was, kind of, okay, great. We didn't know whether they were going to do anything with it. We had no feedback mechanism from traditional advertising to know whether or not it was working, whether or not it was effective, whether or not anything, that impression, that the advertisement was seen was having any impact on the potential consumer. In the social media context, we absolutely can have an impact on that. And so, and we can get that feedback almost immediately. And so we know whether or not it is being engaged with on a deeper level besides just the impression. So if the goal is to have, and so just as in a traditional advertisement, part of it could be to the goal of a piece of content, of a particular post, for instance, could be just impression based, could be just creating some sort of awareness. But if the goal is to create engagement and that's not coming through, then you have to otherwise reevaluate what the content itself is actually doing. So part of it may be to have including some sort of call to action for the consumer to do something and creating an effective call to action that gets the consumer maybe pushed or nudged a little bit of the way into the marketing funnel. So you're not necessarily looking for a person to go directly to the checkout page of a website, but in fact to go to an information page on the website where you can now draw them further into the funnel. More of an inbound marketing sort of technique where social media is at the top of the funnel. So in that regard, I don't think it. I think it requires kind of reanalyzing what actually is going on in the content that's being created, and then moving forward from potentially testing other types of content and seeing if there's a better or more increased effect on that instead.
Okay, another question, quick question, a couple of quick questions on the same person. One is, we have these conferences, right? My organization has, and everybody has conferences to attract faculty to come and learn about new things. So how do you increase the participation of people coming to these conferences? What's the best social media tool to use, maybe?
So obviously we've discussed Facebook. I find it's kind of interesting in terms of conferences. The thing that ends up getting one of the most takeoffs is Twitter. At least here for in the US for a lot of our academic conferences, because one of the things that a lot of conferences do is live stream tweets with a particular conference hashtag, and that allows users at the conference to be able to share some of the content that they're getting in real time and kind of aggregate that content using a hashtag. So it creates participation before the event if you can encourage people to use a relatively simple hashtag that is not being used really by anybody else, a rather unique hashtag, but also allows you to aggregate some of so for instance, I may be sitting through a session on Twitter, and you may be sitting through a session on Snapchat, and ultimately we'd both like to share our takeaways with other people at the conference who, because we were going to a session simultaneously, did not get to see the other session. So by sharing that content on Twitter and a unique hashtag that is memorable and can be appended to a tweet, now I can see the content, you can see the content, and even though we were at simultaneous sessions across the hall, we both have access to each other's impressions about what was being talked about, and that helps to create some of the connection both before the conference and during the conference, and potentially even after the conference. So I think that's kind of an interesting question to have. But my thing would be to go with more of a Twitter angle, I think, on that.
Okay, and one last question, some learning resources, faculty develop learning resources. What's the best way to promote marketing of the learning resources? Any thoughts on that?
Again, I think it's a function of who you're looking at. If we're looking at, educating other faculty, I think that one's actually kind of been a stretch to get other faculty members in terms of social media to be able to learn. And part of it, I think, like you mentioned, is sort of generational. I'm a person who, as a 30-something, am always trying to kind of be, as I mentioned, on the cutting edge where I can understand for my students to be able to discuss X, Y, Z. Whereas older faculty can sometimes, if you're not staying on top of it, it becomes kind of a drag in terms of staying on top of which things. And so part of it, I think, is disposition to understanding technology. So it's very hard, I think, for me to answer the question of where faculty should go, because I think it kind of is, how willing are you to invest in understanding this type of technology? And, being able to pull it on as a one-off per semester is very difficult to do as a faculty member. Oftentimes I'm having to change slides, for instance, from one semester to the next. And the reason I can do that is because I've kind of got a personal investment in the technology. When you lack that investment, it becomes very difficult to say, I'm going to teach Facebook, but then they switched it up and now what I taught this semester is irrelevant and I don't know anything. And I don't have anything further. And I've got to do all this work. So I think a large part of it is having that personal commitment as a faculty member to be willing to go out and kind of do the work on a continuous basis to educate yourself on these things.
Okay, Michael, you can wrap it up.
Yes, thank you again. Thank you for everybody for tuning in. This has been a great session, as all the webinars have been. And so we, in order to plan ahead, there's something in the entrepreneurship and innovation literature called user innovation and or crowdsourcing. So we're going to crowdsource some ideas out to you guys and women, and hopefully get some feedback. So you'll be receiving a short survey pretty soon from us. Please do take the time. It won't take very long to complete it, but your input is very important to us in how we structure these programs in terms of the content, and other things that you might have opinions about, how we can make these a richer and better experience for you, the listeners. So thanks again. This concludes it for this year, but we hope to be back again with you all next year. So
Okay,
that's
thank
it.
you,
Have a great.
thank you, Michael. Thank you, Spencer.
Thank
It's been
you
great.
for having me.
Thank you very much. Bye.